This is the ZT0561. It's a Hinderer based design. It's a flipper. To start though, this blade has been reground by Kyley Harris of CKC Knives. It has basically a very high grind. It has almost no secondary edge bevel. It's only a few thou thick. And it blends into a convex, and the last section, about 1/4 of an inch of it down by the edge, again slightly increases in curvature. To give you an idea of just how well this cuts, on deep cuts in wood with a lot of force, it cuts almost 3 times as well as a standard Mora. And that's in regards to how many slices it takes to remove a certain amount of rough waste material from a piece of wood. However, while that sounds very impressive, and it is, it's not actually a practical advantage, because you can't actually use this knife in that manner for the reasons I'm going to talk about now. In regards to the ergonomics, a lot of people will comment on this general handle shape as one that's well contoured. I'm not exactly sure what kind of hand that they have. If you just take this in a regular sort of hammer grip, which is basically like this, named after, because that's essentially the way most people hold hammers, and you give it a very tight squeeze, there's a couple of things that you'll notice immediately that are relatively positive, but some are relatively negative. First, you get very strong indexing in this area. And by indexing, I mean you make contact with both the forward and rear part of your grip, so it's both stable in effect how you can control it and also how you exert force. So again, in the forward part of the grip, you make excellent contact all throughout this region. And this actual guard, which is basically of course the flipper, serves as a secondary contact point for your index finger, which you mightn't think of, but is very important in, again, working with the blade, and being able to exert force this way, again, stabilizes your grip. Very positive. Down at the end down here, again, you get very strong indexing. You can feel contact all along the bottom and all along the top of your grip. So again, very good control down here. The problem is throughout the middle. So your middle finger and ring finger make very little contact. They're fairly loose actually in the grip. So what you end up with when you start doing heavy cutting is you get relative abrasion from the jimping, which is quite harsh in this area and in this area. And you get it so all along your thumb and index finger and all along your pinky finger and edge of the hand right here, but you make very little contact in the middle. And you can exert a lot of force, of course, with your 2 middle fingers in the center of your hand, but again, they're not making contact with this handle. And the reason that that's the case is if you cup your hand, you can see that your middle fingers are actually higher, then they make an arc, and the arc goes up. Well, this handle does sort of the opposite. It flares at the end, and it's actually thinner in the middle. So when you grip it and give it a good squeeze, again, you don't get good contact in this area because these fingers are naturally raised away. So an example of a knife which basically takes into account your actual curvature of your hand, the handle sort of looks like this. And this is a chef's knife from Kyley Harris, CKC Knives. So when you grip this and give it a decently hard squeeze, it feels completely different. You again get very good indexing up front, you get very good indexing down by your pinky finger, but you get very good indexing right throughout the middle and even back of your hand. So when you're working with this, your entire hand is making uniform contact during the cut, which means you're generating a fatigue throughout your entire hand, which maximizes, of course, your ability to work and minimizes your fatigue rate. And it also spreads out contact to any kind of abrasion or whatever is minimized. But with a handle design like this that doesn't allow full contact throughout the entire center of your hand, what you get, of course, is localized high pressure around your index finger and thumb and around your pinky and the back of your hand. That's actually amplified by this, as one of my friends called it, super mega tactical jimping. This is really sharp. It's that sharp you can easily use it as a wood rasp. So for example, you can easily cut a notch into a piece of wood instantaneously, and that was actually with the G10 side of it. So on both sides right there, and even by the bottom, again, this is very sharp. Easily cuts into woods dramatically, so does the same thing to your hand when you try to use it. Now of course, if you use decent gloves, the jimping just becomes basically a secondary retention system. But without it, it's kind of interesting. And like I said, it amplifies the fact that you're mainly making contact here and mainly making contact here. Those are the two jimping regions. So when you do some heavy cutting, now again, this has been reground. What you end up with is something that looks like this all along the contact areas, and you can see the massive difference inside my index finger and thumb and in my pinky finger, and there's very little effect in my two center fingers compared to, again, the massive contact that you make in and around your index finger and thumb and your pinky and your hand, center of your hand back here, compared to, again, your index and middle finger. So the rates of abrasion are concentrated. So the security, assuming you can handle the level of abrasion, is very high because it essentially bites into your hand, and the only way for the knife to actually move is for your skin to actually be dislodged in that area. So the knife is locked very securely in hand. So it's, but again, around this point and this point, it doesn't generally make a lot of contact in this area. And again, I'm talking mainly about sort of hammer or saber type grips. If you do any kind of reverse grip or an ice pick grip, the handle is, I would say, almost non-functional. You try to grab it like this, what happens is the flipper just bites straight into your hand, unless you have a relatively small hand. But the flipper bites into your hand, this index finger point bites into your hand, and the back of this bites into your hand. It's very, very uncomfortable, to the point that if you tried to do ice pick type work like this, I think it would cut through your hand. It's, like I said, very uncomfortable. And in standard reverse grips, the same thing happens. This bites very strongly into your hand, to the point, again, where just a light squeeze immediately is a very high pressure point. And again, all through these areas. So I do it with my other hand, and there's no way to get essentially under it and away from the point. Now of course you're not going to go up like that, but even if you get your hand underneath it, if you give it a very good squeeze, because of the way it tapers back, it generates a massive high pressure point instantaneously. And the only way to get away from it is to grip down so far that you're actually gripping around this, which then itself becomes a secondary contact point right into your hand. So it's a handle that doesn't have a lot of versatility in regards to grips. It's mainly suited for your hammer or saber style grips or side pinch grips. Even then though, it's one that's maximized for security, and it does security basically through abrasion or abrasion like contact, which essentially means it's not shape locking security, which is a handle like this. This handle is extremely smooth. Now it's not polished, but it would sort of be the equivalent of satin finish for wood. But it's very difficult for your hand to move around on this as soon as you tighten it up, because what you actually have to do, because it's so flared in the middle, you actually have to spread your fingers apart. So in order to move forward or move back on that, because again this fits the natural curve of your hand, you actually have to push your pinky or push your index finger out of the way to allow them to ride up over the hump. So essentially, as long as you can keep your hand in this position, the knife can't move forward because they're locked in by the hump. So that's shape indexing. And it's not, like I said, even if this handle was completely smooth, even if the handle was completely lubricated with oil, it still won't come ahead unless your hand opens up to the point that it allows the shape to pass through. So that's an example of a shape indexed grip. And shape index grip have or can be stable with almost zero friction. This handle here has a slight shape indexing, and that's essentially why your index finger cutout is for. But it mainly indexes through retention from essentially basically a friction or abrasion type indexing, which makes it relatively uncomfortable if you try to do extended sort of hard cutting with it. Now, the argument though against that is that this isn't a knife that's actually intended to be used for extended type cutting work. It's not like you're actually going to do 100 hard slices into wood with this. It's not like you're going to be cutting endless pieces of rope. It's a knife that you take out that you need extremely high security that it don't move. You use one or two relatively heavy cuts and you move on your way. Again, that's the sort of general argument and why they maximize security over ergonomics. Now, this isn't the actual official line from ZT or Hinderer. It's just the sort of pseudo implication arguments that you get, and it does make a bit of sense. But again, this general handle shape with the relatively dramatic end flare, which I believe Strider popularized originally, not 100% sure, but if you look at their early folder designs, they don't have the generally very aggressive index finger, but they were one of the first folders that I see anyway that were, again, had this sort of general narrow to dramatic flare out at the end of the handle, and the Hinderer is very much like that. So that's some early thoughts on the handle. Not one that's particularly well suited for utility, especially long-term utility, but very high indexing. You know exactly where you're holding the handle at all times and where your hand is on it without looking at it, because of the shape of it and because of the jimping. And the jimping is essentially extremely focused on retention, so much so that it's near impossible to move on it. The thumb ramp jimping, again, there's no way my thumb can slide forward unless I actually rip the skin completely right off my thumb. But again, as soon as you make contact with it, it's a very high pressure point. One of the questions I'm going to be interested in looking at, of course, is what's the actual scope of work of this blade? Now, of course, you can do pretty much anything with any knife. You can use this for light work, but it's obviously not designed to excel there. I mean, this is a knife that's designed to excel for light work. Cardboards, papers, plastic, meats, small vegetables, paring type work. It has a 20 thou thick blade, the edges at a very low angle, and they come very sharp. This is a Havilland Peranta edge, and these are disposable scalpel blades, which you can of course sharpen yourself, but they cost as low as 15 cents if you buy them in big packs and on sale. So it's obviously not a knife that's made to compete at that level with light utility work. Moving up a step, you have something like this from Benchmade, which is a knife designed by Doug Ritter. This also has been reground. I reground this one, and you can tell because if you look at the plunge lines, I completely massacred it. It's very similar in size to the ZT-0561, but the blade on the ZT is significantly thicker. Overall, it's significantly heavier. So an interesting question is, what types of activities are you going to be using where the ZT clearly outperforms something like the Benchmade Ritter? They have to be activities which take into account the heavier mass, heavier heft or swing in hand, and the thicker and stronger blade. However, in order for these things to actually come into play, the lock and general construction of the blade has to be able to take a much higher lateral load, has to be able to take a much higher level of impacts and not sustain damage. Because of course, if the lock or general construction fails, when you start doing heavier prying, when you start doing heavier chopping, well then you've restricted the scope of work of this knife to much lighter cutting. Well, if you're going to do that, you should scale back the knife and you end up with something like this, because of course it's lighter, it's also much more inexpensive. And what is the point of having the much thicker blade and a much heavier overbuilt handle if the construction can't take that level of prying and sort of impact type work? So that's one of the interesting things that I'll be looking at.